Most people think manipulation ends the moment they stop tolerating it. It doesn't. In fact, the moment a manipulator realizes they can't control you anymore is often when their behavior becomes the most revealing. Because control doesn't disappear, and it adapts. The person who once pressured you suddenly becomes polite. The one who used guilt starts acting confused. The one who used anger becomes strangely distant. At first, this feels like progress, like the problem is finally over. But in reality, something else is happening. The tactics are changing. And once you see the 5 patterns manipulators almost always use when control starts slipping, you'll start noticing them everywhere. The first thing you need to understand is that manipulation is built on predictability. A manipulator studies your reactions the same way a chess player studies openings. They learn which buttons create guilt, which tone creates compliance, which pressure makes you explain yourself. Once those reactions become predictable, control becomes easy. But the moment your responses stop following that script, the manipulator experiences something they don't expect: loss of leverage. And people who rely on control rarely accept that loss immediately. Instead, they start running experiments, small behavioral tests designed to answer one question: is this person actually out of my control? Or are they just resisting temporarily? That's why the behaviors you are about to see appear. They aren't random, they're diagnostic moves, attempts to discover whether your independence is real or just temporary. But here's the part most people miss. The real danger isn't the obvious manipulation. It's the moment the tactics become subtle enough that you start doubting your own judgment. Sign number 1, the politeness trap. The first thing many manipulators do when control slips is something most people completely misread. They become unusually polite. The person who once pressured you suddenly sounds calm, respectful, even supportive. At first, this can feel like progress. Maybe you think the conflict is over. Maybe you think they've finally accepted your boundaries. But very often, what you're actually seeing is a reset attempt. When pressure stops working, manipulators frequently switch to cooperation mode. Not because they've changed, but because politeness lowers your defenses. Think about it. If someone stops arguing and starts sounding reasonable, most people relax. They explain more, they reopen conversations. And that creates a new opportunity for influence. Because the goal of manipulation isn't always force. Sometimes the goal is simply to get you comfortable enough to re-enter the conversation on their terms. Sign number 2, the victim switch. When politeness fails to restore influence, many manipulators move to something far more effective. They become the victim. Suddenly, the conversation shifts. Instead of discussing what they did, the focus becomes how your behavior is affecting them. You might hear things like, "Why are you being so distant lately?" "I was only trying to help you." "I don't understand why you're acting like this." Notice what's happening. The discussion quietly moves away from their actions and toward your reaction. And that shift matters, because guilt is one of the most powerful tools of emotional control. If someone can make you feel responsible for their discomfort, your instinct is to repair the situation. You start explaining yourself. You soften your boundaries. And in that moment, control begins to return. That's why manipulators often switch to victim mode. It's not weakness, it's strategy. Sometimes this shift happens so smoothly that you don't even notice it. You walk away from the conversation feeling like you somehow became the problem. You started out defending a boundary, but somewhere along the way, you found yourself explaining your tone, your timing, your reaction. The discussion quietly moved away from what they did and toward how you responded. And that confusion isn't accidental. It's the result of a very specific tactic. When guilt enters the conversation, people instinctively try to repair the emotional tension. They clarify, they soften, they start offering explanations that were never required in the first place. And the moment you start defending yourself instead of examining the behavior that created the conflict, the balance of control begins to shift again. And that's why the victim switch is so effective. It doesn't force compliance, it invites it. Sign number 3, reputation maneuver. When direct influence stops working, some manipulators change the battlefield entirely. They stop trying to control you directly. Instead, they start shaping how other people see you. At first, it rarely looks dramatic. It's usually small comments, a subtle story about something you said, a slightly altered version of an event, nothing extreme, just enough information placed in the right places to introduce doubt. Because if someone can't control you directly, the next best option is controlling the environment around you. Influence spreads through perception. If others begin to see you as difficult, cold, or unreasonable, pressure slowly returns from a different direction. And that pressure can be even more powerful than the manipulator's original tactics. Because now the influence isn't coming from one person, it's coming from the group. Sign number 4, the strategic withdrawal. The fourth behavior often confuses people the most because it looks like the manipulation has ended. The person suddenly pulls back. They stop arguing, they stop messaging, they stop trying to influence you at all. At first, this feels like peace, it's like the conflict is finally over. But in many cases, this withdrawal is another form of pressure. Psychologists sometimes call it intermittent reinforcement. When someone who once demanded attention suddenly becomes distant, your brain begins searching for resolution. You start wondering what changed. You replay conversations. You consider reaching out just to restore normalcy. And that's exactly the point. Because if they can't control you through pressure, silence can sometimes pull you back into the interaction voluntarily. Not through force, but through uncertainty. Sign number 5, the replacement signal. The final signal often appears when the manipulator realizes something uncomfortable. They can't control you anymore. And when that realization becomes clear, the strategy shifts again. Instead of trying to regain influence, they begin demonstrating that your position can be replaced. You may notice them suddenly giving attention to someone else, someone new, someone who now receives the approval or cooperation that once came from you. This isn't always about genuine connection. Often it's a signal, a quiet message meant to suggest that your independence doesn't matter, that your absence won't change anything. But ironically, this behavior reveals something important. Manipulators rarely try to replace people who were never valuable to them. Replacement signals usually appear when control has been permanently lost. Once you start recognizing these patterns, something interesting happens. The interactions that once felt confusing start becoming predictable. You notice the same sequence appear again and again. Pressure, politeness, guilt, distance, reputation pressure, replacement. Different people, same structure, and that realization changes the dynamic completely. Because manipulation relies on something very simple. It works best when the pattern remains invisible. When someone believes they are reacting naturally rather than responding to a predictable strategy. But once you begin recognizing the structure behind those behaviors, the influence weakens. Not because the manipulator stops trying, but because their tactics are no longer operating in the dark. And the only remaining option is to rebuild that control somewhere else. Manipulation rarely looks dramatic when it begins. It looks like small adjustments, a change in tone, a shift in blame, a story told slightly differently. And most people don't recognize those patterns until the influence has already taken hold. But once you understand these signals, something important changes. You stop reacting automatically. You start seeing the structure behind the behavior. And when you can see the structure, manipulation loses most of its power. Because control only works when the pattern stays invisible. So here's the real question. Looking back at your own life, which of these signals have you already seen?